Good day. I feel pretty honored to get Friday morning because anyone who's here really wanted to be here because most of you were probably out pretty late last night. I have no conflict of interest today other than talking about force plates. All right, so I'm going to give you a little backstory here. This is a setup we have in our daily environment. That's an athlete that trains with us every day on our bilateral force plates in the middle of the gym. So that's one thing I want to make really clear here. We're going to talk a lot about strategy and philosophy of monitoring and how to make it better. And that's one of those non-negotiables. It has to be in a place where you can use it and action it quickly. So that's in the middle of the gym. You can also see the pool behind us. I like to say we're out on the beach. In the Olympic Institute, we have all the sports all around us. That's a camera crew because in Olympic sport, every time you approach an Olympics, they do a lot of little things for TV and stuff. So that happens from time to time, but it just provides us a good little photo of what we're doing. Now, I could talk about this all day. I really like force plates and what we do with them. I think we've carved out a cool niche. But I think we need to do something different. And so I decided to tell a little different story. And so we're going the Star Wars route because I just think it'll answer a lot of needs that people have. Because the first thing I get all the time around force plates is, but what number do I take? What's the number? I got force plates now, what's the number? And to me, that's not where you got to start. So I missed a golden opportunity here to have this rolling with the music and everything. That would have been really cool, and then you guys would have never forgotten. Instead, it's just a screenshot. But today's going to be about how to become a monitoring Jedi. If you guys saw The Last Jedi, that was in my head when I made this. I had to make this beforehand, but I was getting pretty excited for Star Wars to come out. So we're going to talk about four key ideas around becoming a monitoring Jedi. Number one, use the Force, Luke. If you think about Obi-Wan in A New Hope, when he's going to drop his bomb in the Death Star, he gets in his head and just says, just be, feel, get in that environment. Recruiting rebels and not Stormtroopers. That one's crucial for buy-in and how you're going to put any system into place. Stick with your lightsaber. Lightsabers are really cool. We all have the little toys. Our kids have the little toys. And lastly, a Jedi's role in Star Wars world is to protect the galaxy. So using the Force, a lot of times, especially now with the mix of technology into what we do, and a lot of different companies and a lot of different tools out there, and with social media being so popular, we get lots of discussions around, oh, you're a data guy. I think coaching's about intuition. And then we get that art versus science debate, and people go crazy, and now we have twice as many characters to do that, and then it all melts down. If you've never read it, Risk Savvy by Gerd Gigerenzer is a really interesting book, and I recommend it to everyone. It's a book all about uncertainty and how we make decisions. So he's a researcher in Germany around decision-making under uncertainty in complex environments. And in the book, he talks about intuition and how we kind of pass it off as something spooky and weird and that it doesn't apply. And he has two quotes about intuition here. Intuition is unconscious intelligence based on personal experience and smart rules of thumb. So number one with that unconscious part is that you don't know necessarily why you came up with that feeling or idea on the spot, right? Maybe if we're talking about coaching right now, you're watching someone lift, you're watching someone run, and sometimes you're like, we're going to shut it down right there. Or, you know what, let's go up 5 kilos. Or, you know what, try this cue where you squeeze this. Sometimes you can explain it, and sometimes it'll be a week later or a couple hours later where you're like, yeah, I did it more because I felt this was off. Personal experience is a key one. You can't really develop intuition when you're born. You don't just naturally know. It comes from what you've seen and what you've learned, and you're constantly building this bank of knowledge that you're going to reference in that unconscious way. And intuition's based on smart rules that take into account only some of the information. And when we talk about force plates and monitoring, it's key to know that anyone who comes up here and talks about one aspect of monitoring, we'll never have the entire picture. You could say, I'm collecting heart rate, I'm collecting RPE, I got GPS, I got force plates. There's still going to be information missing, and there always will be. So how do you handle that and say, okay, I'm missing some information, but I believe this rule should hold, and I'm going to make that decision. So we're going to talk a lot about decision making and how intuition's not a bad thing at all. It's something that we use a lot. So part of your Jedi training in terms of developing intuition has to include data collection, in my opinion. So if we're going to develop these rules of thumb or these heuristics to make decisions, you have to have a reference point. Sometimes we hear people talking about, oh, old school coaches didn't have to look at all this stuff. Well, if we think of track and field, they looked at time. They knew when people were fast and not fast. Brad yesterday was talking about in his practical about the sound of your feet, and he said Ray Charles would be a good sprint coach because he can hear footfalls and he knows what's effective sprinting. But realistically, nobody knew what was good sounding sprinting until they knew that it worked, right? The first time two people ran, until you know who's going to win, you don't know which one's the right way to run. So you always have to have a result that you're looking for you to go back and refer to. So if you don't know who's getting stronger and who jumps high, and if you don't know what a 50 centimeter versus a 40 centimeter jump look like, you can't start to have this intuition of, okay, that looked good, we're going to go on from there. Reflect often you must. That's from Yoda. I don't do the voice. We do a bad job in this industry of going back and constantly auditing our own programs. We kind of build out plans for the next 3 months, and then we just build on top of it. And I don't think we do a good job of saying, did I get what I needed? Should I go back and do that again? Do I have to switch to strength endurance or power or whatever it is that we're doing? We don't audit ourselves and reflect often and say, did I get the goal that I needed? Did we get the result that we needed from the programming? And the last one, trust the force. Be content when the process is sound. We all want to push the envelope, and we all want to innovate, and we all want more information. And that's extremely valuable, and it should always be the goal. You shouldn't just say, I got force plates, I'm done. I don't need to collect anything else. Then I go RPE, and then I go GPS. We're always trying to answer more questions, but there's a certain point in the process, and if I go back to GERD, where you have to act based on some of the information. So at some point, you can say, I have a pretty good process, I've audited this process, and I'm going to move forward with this process. I'm going to be confident that we're putting our athletes in a good position to achieve what we're trying to achieve, which could be a certain performance outcome. We could be talking about overall health and well-being of them in the sport environment. But there's a time where if you've done the work, you have to be content that it's going your way. This is a paper by Sanchez Medina and the group from Spain on velocity tracking during training. Came out in 2011, so it's been out for a while. And for me, this is one of my favorite papers to sort of reference when we're talking about this idea of intuition and building intuition. There's a lot of people that when we program, we're gonna program lifts based on reps in reserve, right? You're gonna say, do 3 of a 5 RM or do 6 of an 8 RM. And this paper did a really, really good job of just showing what is the result when we do these reps. So this example graph is sort of their reference point. The red bars at the start, they picked a load. This is a squat example. They picked a load that people could move at an average concentric velocity of 1 meter per second. So let's just say that's one plate, 60 kilos. So the athlete or the subject came in, they did their 3 reps with 60 kilos. It was 1.03, so it met their criteria. Then they did 3 sets of 12, and in brackets, there's a 12 in brackets as well. That just means it's at a 12 RM. So then they tracked the velocity at each rep, and they have sort of these percentage decrements that you can see. I don't think I need the pointer, but I'll do it anyway. So you have percentage decrements across a set and the average across all 3 sets. And then what they did is they came back after and they did that same 60 kilo load for 3 reps. And you can see the loss there. Well, then they charted this with a whole bunch of combinations. So different numbers of reps per set relative to that RM. Then what they did is they tracked for squat and bench the loss of that velocity, or the average velocity of the lift over the sets, the loss of the velocity with that criteria on weight, loss of counter movement jump height, and this one, I'm highlighting this because that's kind of what we're talking about with our force plate stuff, but you can also see with lactate pneumonia that this isn't independent. This is the same metabolic sort of signatures that we're talking. All of these measures move together. The loss of velocity, the loss of jump height, the buildup of lactate pneumonia. The really, really crazy thing here is just to see how much of a difference you lose, say, in these criteria on weight or with jump height. It's basically double. If you go to your RM versus leaving half those reps in the tank, that's a huge difference in what the athlete's going to experience after. When they walk out of that set or that workout, how they feel in their legs and their body, everything like that. So if you're thinking of how they're going to be tomorrow, that's really crucial. So when we're talking about monitoring, this is the kind of paper that coaches for a long time have experimented with this, right? They've developed this idea that, oh, all of a sudden, if I leave 2 reps in the tank, I think they'll feel okay. This is just an example how with data collection you can build that intuition. I don't need to come back and reference this paper every time and say, well, I'm going to take 3 reps off because it should be half the percentage loss in counter movement jump height, et cetera, et cetera. That's just silly. But now that I've seen it and I can show it to interns and young coaches, they can go, I see. I don't have to always go to the RM because that's going to have a certain cost that maybe I don't want to deal with tomorrow. If I'm playing tomorrow, I don't necessarily want to dig into that hole. So that's something we're going to come back to. Recruiting rebels and not stormtroopers. So the first thing about monitoring is that you have to make the coach's job easier or better. Sometimes better is not easier. But it has to be one or the other. If you're not, they're not going to care. They're not going to want to do whatever it is you're doing. And then that makes for all the stories that we tell at the bar, like, man, this coach and I, we don't get along because he won't do all the stuff I want to do. I got these cool ideas and he doesn't care. We have to work with them, and we could spend all night talking about how we deal with coaches, but the truth is that we have to meet in the middle. Number 2, if athletes don't see the point, the data could be worthless. I say could here because not every athlete's going to bomb every test because they don't like it. I don't want to say that. Athletes will often do what they're told and they will try. But there are some that don't seem to always give the full effort in some testing if they don't see the point. And you can tell. You look at the data and you go, this shouldn't happen. You know, if you think about repeat sprints or shuttles, we know that we're going to have a certain decrement because it's physiology, and then someone coasts the whole way, and you're like, that can't happen. Someone forgot to go all out the first few. But the last point is key for me because I get a lot of questions whenever we do force plates, and one thing is, I'm going to mention here, some of the athletes jump every day. And a lot of people ask me, well, if they're jumping every day, like, how do you know they're not just going to change their style and stuff to get a different workout or make it easy? Believers will surprise you with what they're willing to do. The moment you get a coach and an athlete to believe in what you're doing from a monitoring perspective, they want to know. They want to know they're getting better. They want to know where they're at. And they're willing to offer themselves up for science. They're willing to say, yeah, I'll do that test. You want to jump for me today? Do you want to do a mid-thigh pull? Yeah, I want to know. I want to know. So the more that you share the data with them, you tell them why, and they see that it's actionable, they will do this stuff for you. So that's important. Make them believe that it's important, and they will do it for you. So I wanted to just bring that chart up again because these rules apply in practice too. We're looking at RMs, and we're thinking this is just about squatting and benching, but the moment you go into your sport practice, and in my bio, Ian was talking about diving and hockey as 2 sports I work really closely with. I work with all of Diving Canada athletes, and as you saw in the picture, the pool is right behind the gym. So they literally can come into the gym, warm up with me, jump, they walk out, and they go and they dive right there. So we now have a flow with the coaches with this information, with breaking up workloads, like at any point that we think they're not fit to do certain dives, they can always come back to the weight room. They can do stuff like that, that some of you won't have that ability in your environment. But once you have this idea, you can talk about, gassing someone at the end of the practice is going to be one of these 3 times 12 at 12 RM, and there's going to be a cost the next day, the next morning. So once we have this idea and we have this data, we can reflect on it, and that can go into our intuitions about, okay, I know what that looks like to go to fatigue or failure in a squat, but it's the same when I do sprints. It's the same when I do certain conditioning, especially stuff that's going to build up a lot of lactate. Stick with a lightsaber. So I'm going to get into force plates a lot here. I decided to make the talk a little bit more general about monitoring, but the big thing about the lightsaber is that the Jedi make their own. That's number one, that's really cool. So you never see it really happening. Anakin at one point is fixing his lightsaber in the early episodes, but that's a really interesting concept for me in sports science, is that, first of all, the Jedi build their own weapon, so they know all about it. They know how it works. It's also not near as complicated as something like the Death Star. There's just one piece, there's one rod, and they wield it accordingly. The Death Star is super complex, and because of that, it can be destroyed. So if we talk about Taleb and the ideas of fragility and anti-fragility, this is kind of what we're talking about. So with that, force plates are just fancy scales. There's a lot of coaches who don't yet know the science behind what's going on in a force plate that want the technology because it looks really cool, and it is cool. And they don't realize that it's just a fancy scale. And once you start to understand that point, you understand the physics of it, it's a lot simpler to talk about what's happening and how to take context out of that. The secret sauce is understanding the patterns that emerge as a function of the ever-changing athlete in front of you. So a lot of our athletes will jump every day. That allows us to see what happens normally, what variation happens day to day, what variation happens between different lifts, practices, as they adapt, as they get better, stronger, more powerful, different things like that. So before we think about making rules that we're going to say like, oh, this is always bad and this is always good, you have to have a team. You have to see, wow, this athlete crashes every time we do this type of conditioning, but this athlete could do this 5 days in a row, no big deal. And you start to understand what's a flag for one athlete, not a flag for another. So context is king. And when I say context, that's where variability in measures matters. Everyone should understand the basics of stats and be able to look at a number and say, can I make a decision on this number? How much do I know about this number? Does it vary a lot? Does it vary a little? What happens tomorrow with this measure? What happens if I do this 5 times? Once you have that information, it'll give you a lot of context about, can I say that this was real? This last point about, I said Jedi build their own lightsabers, and can you build yours? Now, I want to be really clear here. It's not very efficient for everyone to try to build their own monitoring system. It's not. It takes a long time and a lot of headaches, and there's a lot of really good companies downstairs that do this well. But what I want you to know is, do you know how it works? Could you explain how it works? If you had an extra 4 hours in every day that no one else gets, could you build your own? It's more efficient to buy a good system, and you should probably do that if you have the money. But it's not an excuse to not understand how the system works. When you go to pick a system, or you pick measures, or you pick whether or not you're going to put force plates into your daily environment, you need to know why and what's happening. So if we talk about force plates, there's a guy named Rob Gathercole he's got about 4 papers now looking at force plates in different measures and how they track through time and with work. And this was his first paper, and they essentially had people do, I think it was 3 300-meter shuttles, or it was 3 wing gates. I think it was the shuttles. Basically, they just bagged people in the lab as hard as they could, and then hopefully they didn't throw up, and then they got them to jump. So they have, the graphs are going to be hard to read, and that's fine. You guys have access to the PDFs. Oh, but essentially what's happening here is there's three different things happening here. In the top left is force velocity profile of an athlete. So this is not a normal force time trace you get when you jump, but this explains basically what's happening as someone moves and puts force into the ground when they jump. So if you picture a jump with hands on hips and I'm dropping down and I'm unweighting, that first part in that curve is going to be negative. I have a negative velocity as I move down towards the ground. Positive velocity will be when I go up in the air. So how fast do I go? Velocity is on the x-axis, so the further to the left is the faster somebody dips. And then it turns over at 0. We're going to be still in the very bottom, and then we're going to have a positive velocity until we take off and it crashes. On the y-axis, we have that force that we put out. So the bigger those areas are, the bigger the area under that curve, the faster and more force we're putting into the plate. The thing about jumping is that jump height is determined by the total impulse. The total impulse is force times time, so it's really the area under the curve. There's slight exceptions of what parts of the curve we do and don't include, but essentially you can just imagine all the area under the curve decides how high you jump. So that's our number one concept, which means I can change how high I jump in multiple different ways. So the moment we want to start tracking more context, we look at the shape. So the one underneath is power time, so the same idea. The solid line was the first measure, the baseline measure. So you can see after we fatigue these athletes, they have measures that immediately after this fatiguing exercise, 24 hours after, and 3 days, 72 hours after. So if we look at the force velocity curve in the top left, we can see that they move less quickly on the way down and they produce less force. So the total area under their curve goes down. On the bottom, it's really just shifting the power curve to the right and left. So we do a deeper negative power because we move faster as we go down, and we have a higher positive power, and it happens earlier when we're fresh. On the right, these are, I believe they're effect sizes of how a whole bunch of different alternative measures move when we fatigue people. And we have baseline 24 hours and 72 hours again. And so you can see there's all sorts of different measures here, and you're going to have to go into the paper. I'm not going to explain all of them because that would take a long time, especially if you aren't familiar with force time curves. But you can see there's certain measures that immediately after, the day after, and maybe 3 days later are very significantly perturbed compared to normal. Those are the kind of things that might give us the first signal of what's going on inside an athlete. When we talk about fatigue, we don't want to get too specific about what kind. Is it neuromuscular? Is it metabolic? Is it peripheral? Is it central? What we want to know is this affecting the performance of my athlete, yes or no? I recommend you understand what kinds of fatigue exist, but when we're talking about force plates, I don't want to try to say like, oh, this one is definitely explaining peripheral because of, doesn't matter. Performance is perturbed, performance is decreased, therefore I'm going to take that into account. At the end of the day, that's what we're after all the time is performance, so you want to know, can my athlete go out today and perform at their best? So time to peak force, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth one, FTCT, the eighth one, and then eccentric duration, the 11th one, are 3 that move a lot. And so those are something I'm going to show you after that we've built into our system as sort of our initial flags for how we move. This is a paper by Cory about long-term changes with power type training. So more explosive training with power time, force time, velocity time, and displacement time curves. So if you look at top right, this is essentially the force time curve of a force plate. I didn't really put one up and cut it up for you guys. This is a normalized one, so it just goes from 0 to 100% of time that you're on the ground. But if we had a full signal, it would just essentially, it would bottom out to 0 at 100 because they're in the air, and then there'd be a next part of the curve as they landed. But that's really crucial what's happening there, because it's the exact same response as what Gathercole showed immediately after fatiguing exercise, is if we take the top right force time curve, In black is the baseline. The dotted line is after this sort of power training. I can't remember if it was 8 or 12 weeks. But the important thing is that for almost every athlete in most sports, with great training and non-fatiguing exercise with readiness, we see that curve shift up and to the left. We are essentially trying to maximize, as I said before, the area under the curve. But the second context is now time. Time is always limited in sports. So if our curve goes up and to the left, we keep the same area, but now we shorten the time it takes to get off the ground. That's invaluable. Any athlete who can do the same thing faster than their competitor is going to have an advantage. So with power training, you can see that now that curve shifts left. The drop in force is deeper on the way down, meaning they unweight more, they fall faster, and then when they go to take off, that eccentric moment at the bottom where they stopped and they're about to change directions, that's where they're now taking advantage. So you can see there's a huge section of impulse right here that exists now that didn't before, and then it kind of comes out of this sort of concentric area and moves eccentric. You're going to see that in most sports. You can probably find exceptions for me where certain sports where you're like, no, concentric only is where we want to stay. But 95% of you are going to want this type of adaptation. You want athletes' curves shifting up and to the left. Displacement, power, velocity, they all have the same concept. You move faster in your counter movement, and then you get up faster and get off the ground faster. So now if we talk about creating context, this is a sheet that we've created in Excel. I just want to give you an example. It's not as pretty as a lot of the athlete monitoring systems out there because we built it ourselves and we're not that good. But this is the kind of context that we create on a daily basis. So you can see with the dates, this was in 2017 May. I just took a random athlete in a random week. So this athlete jumps essentially every day. 12s was probably a Friday, and then 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 are probably a week. We have three sections. We have jump height is the first. That's going to be the criteria that we're always going to reference because everyone wants to know how high you jump. That's the global output. It matters. But the second and third, if we go back to the Gather-Cole papers, FTCT and time to force max, those are two things that we've found. First, looking at the research, and second, anecdotally through tracking this stuff over time with a very large number of athletes, they're going to flag first. So a few examples are, if you look at the 18th of May, that's the highest jump of the few days. But it's not necessarily the fastest or the highest FTCT or TF max. And don't worry about the colors as it goes. There's certain quirks in here that I understand. But if I explain the page really quickly, and we talk about what context is, especially in a stats term, this is their running average of their last 6 tests. That's what we've decided is important for an acute time. That will funnel up into the top where we have a running average. There, we check things like standard deviation, coefficient of variation, small worthwhile change, and signal-to-noise ratio. See how clean is the data, how much does it move for this athlete during this time period. We do this for each one of the measures, and we have a few more measures we track, but these 3 ones are probably the first ones we see and the first ones we act on. Then when we come back down, every day that gets added is going to have effect sizes that we've colored just to make decision-making faster and easier based on that. So it's really important. That's always moving. So every day, these colors are going to change relative to where we're at. If I adapt as an athlete and all of a sudden I add tools, as in I jump higher or I do it faster, I do it more efficient, after 2 or 3 days, all these averages bump up. What used to be a blue, which is really exciting, a blue is super compensation. That's kind of a PR. Athletes want to see blue. That's kind of one of the language things in our room. You hit 2 or 3 blues in a row, those blues are now going to be green because you've adapted. So the average is constantly moving with your own variation and your own jump height, and then you get a yellow this week might not be the same as a yellow last week. It all depends on where you're at. So this is just an example that we've built. And there's all sorts of different ways to do that, but this is what context means, is understanding what's happening to your athlete over, say, in this case, it's a week, but we do have some sports that only lift 2 or 3 times a week, and so with that, we might cover 2 weeks because it'll be their last 6 sessions in the gym. I have to thank Brad again. This is his son, Axton, who may or may not be a Sith Lord. And I wanted to use that really cute photo because everyone loves babies. But if you don't understand the tools that you're using, you're on the path to the dark side. What I mean by that is you just don't know what you're doing with it if you don't know the tools, and you may be selecting a measure or making decisions that aren't actually in line with the truth. And so you can just remember the baby with the helmet on, understand your tools, and hopefully that imprints with you. If you see Brad later, you can thank him for that photo. The last section, Protect the Galaxy, is that your monitoring tool system has to serve your athletes in your decision making. Otherwise, it's not really worth anything. We can have a really, really comprehensive system with really cool stats, and if you're not able to actually use it in a productive way, it's not going to do much for you. So there's 4 sort of things that we're going to talk about in this last block. Quality training for training qualities, and we're going to sort of challenge the idea that hypertrophy training and strength endurance and strength and power are all different all the time. The viability of agile periodization, although if you went to Brad's talk yesterday, it might be more about agile programming and not agile periodization. Depends how you want to look at it. Are you following your compass? And I'm going to share some data from one of our athletes to talk about the process of how I use this with force plates. So there's another paper out of Spain. This one came out this year. I think Dr. Haff tweeted it out the other day, which is awesome. I strongly recommend you read it. Essentially, they took 2 groups, okay, and they used velocity tracking to affect their volume load. Both groups squatted the same prescription. So if Daniel and I are both doing our squats, we're both going to do the same general workout. We're both going to squat 5 sets at 80% of our 1 RM. Okay, so we both go in the gym. We attach our push bands. They didn't actually use push, but that's an example. And we go in there and we do our squats. Now, Daniel, he's nervous and he doesn't like to go to failure because he's a bit of a baby. That's life. So he stops when he loses 20% of his velocity. I'm tougher. I'm a tough guy. So I'm like, I'm going all the way to 40%. And we could go all the way back to that first paper to see what that looks like in a set when you lose 40%. But essentially, it was probably like he stopped at 6 out of 12 reps. I probably did 8. And then a full 12 RM, I think they lost 65%. Right? So I essentially do more work than Daniel because I want it more. He doesn't want it that bad. After the 8 weeks, we measured all of our physical qualities. And what happened was Daniel did only 60% of the work that I did. So I did 1.5 times more. Let's say it was an average of 9 reps a set for me, 6 reps a set for him, and we worked at the same percentage of our 1 RM. So when we're looking at performance measures afterward, VL40 is 40% loss. That's tough guy Cory. VL20 is 20% loss. That's Daniel. We can see how much they changed in 1 RM, average velocity of all their reps, average velocity of a certain load that was greater than 1 meter per second, below 1 meter per second, counter movement jump height, and T20 is time on a 20-meter dash. One of the things most people are going to say when you want to build strength is that you have to do more, right? So number 1 RM, what happened? Daniel actually gained more strength than me. He did less work and got stronger, even though we were at the same percentage of load. So it wasn't like he did less reps at a higher load. We were at the same intensity. So he put on 20 kilos, I only put on about 14. Velocities didn't change a ton. Counter movement jump height, he jumped 4 centimeters higher, I jumped 1.5, so again, more than double the increase. And then sprint times, I got slower by 300ths and he got faster by 1. Are those numbers meaningful? Maybe or maybe not. But as a general trend, he got faster, I got slower. So there's the performance side of it. He's performing better than me after that. Luckily, this group went in and biopsied everyone, which is great, because then we get to see all sorts of stuff about muscle fibers and myosin heavy chain expression. Without getting into too much detail, there's sections about area of muscle, volume of muscle, also the representation of percentage of types of muscle fiber. But the ones I circled in really, really beautiful hand-drawn circles in red are type 2X, percentage of area, myosin heavy chain, and fiber type, because those were the biggest changes. Me, as a tough guy who decides I'm always going to go those extra few reps, I lost half of my area and number of type 2 fibers, type 2X, so the most explosive fibers. So despite us lifting the same load, so again, if we're going to classify our workouts, we were both in strength at 80%. I lost half of my 2X fibers, and if you go through the math, you're going to find it comes up in different places. A large part of it is in type 1. Like, I didn't want to put too many red circles, but a lot of it goes into there. Whereas Daniel kept it. So despite not lifting any different load or without different instructions, just not going to failure over 2 months meant that he kept all of his explosive fibers, and I converted a lot of mine out. So when we go back to those performance, it's not necessarily about 80%, is it? It's not about just saying, well, I prescribe strength for strength, I prescribe this for speed, I do this, but sometimes it's about, is our athlete ready to perform every day and get the most out of every rep? And probably, and maybe we can't take too many conclusions from one paper, but Daniel left every session feeling pretty good about himself, and I didn't. So every time I came in, I probably did a worse and worse job with that. And because of that, I'm a lot less explosive. So even though we weren't doing power and speed and all these things, Daniel's in a good place because he kept it and I didn't. So this is another paper that we can talk about taking data, putting into our intuition and going, wow, maybe it's just about how our quality of training, and we can't get too specific about training qualities all the time. That's not to say that there aren't speed things that are different than strength. But the type of training that you do and the quality of it, and that's why we monitor, is to not get into these places. Agile periodization is something that comes up a lot now and as a language, and that's all about adapting to the day. I should probably change the title to Agile Programming, but here's a paper that I think it's out now. It was ahead of print when I first got it, but out of Brazil, Claudino. Now they just use a jump mat with jump height. So I want you to know that when I talk about force plates and we talked about all these alternative variables being more precise, you can still go home with a jump mat and say, I can use this in a positive way. This is the plan they had for all their athletes. They said, we're going to induce overreaching over 4 weeks, and then we're going to taper for 2. And what they expect, weeks 1 to 6, are that you either decrease or stable performance, decrease, and then increase, right? That's kind of what we picture every time we program a block and we want to taper out of it and improve. So that was what their goal was. The subjects on the right are people that they didn't intervene, and the subjects on the left are people that they did. So what they would do with that plan is every athlete jumped on the first day of the week. They come in and they jump on their mat. Now, the important concept to remember here is that before they did all this, they had athletes jump 8 times over 2 or 3 days. They created that stats block of how much variability they had and what they in their paper called minimal important difference, but it's essentially smallest worthwhile change or different things like that. They used the 95% confidence interval to decide if a measure inside or outside matters, whether it's important. So then what they did with these athletes during this overreaching phase is every athlete jumped on the first day of the week, and only half the athletes did they adapt their loading based on their jump results. So no athlete knew based whether their workout was adapted to their jump height or not. So that's important. So every athlete comes in, they jump full out. The first star is where they started, and then after that, if your performance went up above that minimal important difference, they loaded you more because they're trying to induce overreaching. So they're like, you're still getting better. We're going to crush you with more load. If your performance went down below the minimal important difference, they took a little bit of load off. And if you were within that error bar or that confidence interval, they kept the load as planned. I didn't put up the results here. You can go find them after. But essentially, the groups that they were able to add more did more work in overreaching, and then through the taper improved their jump heights better. So we can use this information daily to decide how we're going to load in the weight room or in practice, and it can be helpful. So KPIs, Dan Paff uses this term a lot, key performance indicators. You can use any term you want. They are the compass to me. I think we get away from it a lot in this industry about how often we're reflecting on these. Sometimes we feel the pressure to build out a beautifully laid out plan over months and months and months, but we don't check often enough that we're actually chasing certain values that matter. Not every value matters for every athlete. Most athletes have one or two that are important right now that we should get. And it's important that you know what those are. So what are your KPIs? Are you on track? You should monitor. So if we go back to jumping, here's an example athlete in diving. So to give context to this graph, in that Excel sheet that I had all the colors on, this is another tab. This is now a long-term graph. So whenever we populate their sheet every day with their jump height, it populates the acute page, which has our variation on the last 6 jumps or the last 6 sessions. And then we have their long-term, in this case, going from November 2015 all the way up to November 2017. So here's 2 years of jump data. Every dot represents the average of every jump that athlete took in the entire month. So we can feel extremely confident that that dot represents where the athlete was at that point in time. The bars are 95% confidence intervals. So in examples, if you look down at the sort of lower performance, September 2016 to February 2017, we had less data, so you're going to see larger error bars. So when we're deciding what's meaningful change, you want to know that my new performance is up above and beyond those error bars. So we can now go back in time, and if I decided for diving that jump height is important, and in this case, I think it is, I want to know, okay, that first year, maybe I didn't do as good a job. It didn't actually move that much. There's a little variation, and I may have felt really good about myself in May 2016 because I thought we were going up, and then over the summer went back down a bit. Over time, now I can see, okay, we obviously did a way better job in 2017. I reflected a bit on what we were doing. We changed some things up, and now I can see what's possible through a season. So now in 2017, I've got new context. August 2017 is the start of our sort of general preparation. They take a break in July, and then they come back after 4 weeks, and they start again. So right now, we can say that this athlete is trending in a positive way where we want to be, and we can also say, compared to this time in the last 2 years, we're in a better place. This kind of picture that's always updating allows me to do that. Now, at any point when this curve plateaus, if it doesn't go higher than where I was in April, May, June, July 2017, then I know now we're not doing something right because that athlete should at least get back to where they were last year in season, or I should hypothetically get even higher. So time will tell with that because you can't see December or January dots because I submitted these slides before that. But this is an example of how often are you checking your KPIs? How much resolution do you have in the data to know that I'm actually making meaningful change? So the last part of this, I'm going to talk about a little bit of a case study of how I use this data on force plates to affect my decision making in a daily environment and how we can see those changes manifest themselves. So this is a hockey player, a female hockey player who we'll call Ray because it fits in with the fact that we're talking about Star Wars. We're going to show data on force plates, but the number one objective for this athlete was to run faster. I strongly believe that running faster means you're going to skate faster, and so access in the weight room to that kind of transfer, we said, I'm going to measure your 10-meter time regularly. We did it weekly, and we're going to try to get you faster throughout the season. So I didn't show how their 10-meter time changed, but I'll explain where it went when we show the other graphs. Some of the heuristics, or those rules of thumb that I used, that I put into place with my system, I said, when you come in your green or blue, we're going to do speed. We've heard a lot from Charlie Francis and all sorts of people, and there's tons of research on this, that when you have really demanding neurological work like speed, you want to be fresh for that and you'll get better results. We had the example of Daniel and I going to that fatigue point, and whether we were lifting or not, we get more speed work done when it's high quality. So with that sheet that I had earlier, green is normal variation where we're content. Blue is some sort of super compensation. You come in a great place. Yellow means, uh-oh, we're down a bit. Don't need to freak out just yet. And red is, okay, I really suck today in our measures. So I said, I'll do speed work on those blue and green days, and when you come in yellow or red, we're going to do some strength work. We're going to do stuff like the very first study, maybe 3, 4, 5 reps in the tank, and we're going to take it really gradually, and that's how I'm going to plan my weeks. I'm going to be very reactive, but know that I can hit both types of workout in a week, but I didn't say that Tuesdays are always speed. I said, when you come in blue, we're taking advantage. When you come in red, we're flipping. Traditional lifts, I didn't really go heavy. I say mostly 80% 1RM. I did a lot of that reps in reserve. So pretty much every workout was 2 reps in reserve, 3 reps in reserve, 4 reps, because their season was October to May. This was all in season that you'll see the tracking. She's really good at weightlifting, so the majority of the strength work was actually weightlifting, so it was explosive in nature. And because of this tracking, what we were doing, we did more speed work than normal. So we wanted to get faster, so we did more speed work. That should be fairly self-evident. So number 1 is jump height. So this is a lot of data. This is the average of every month from June 2015 to November 2017. So we're looking at 2.5 years of data. And the question on the side is super important to me, because have we made any meaningful changes? So the reason I'm using this case study is I had sort of a mea culpa at the start of this season. It was this 2016-2017 season. We were in the fall, and this is a really good hockey player, and I wanted to make sure we were doing our best work possible. And I said, wow, if I look back over the last year and a bit, I'm not actually sure I did anything. I might not be good at my job. There's moments where we got better, and there's moments where that curve was going up and we were probably really exciting, but long term, her jump height hasn't changed, has it? From July 2015 to August 2016, we don't have meaningful change. It's essentially the same. So I was pretty upset about that. I was like, damn it, I've been doing nothing. So that was part of why this case happened. I said, okay, what am I going to do to make sure that we get better? You can see where the jump height goes through the season. Her season actually ended March 2017, so everything that happens after that for this case study, don't worry about. There's other context to why that came down after. But you can see December, January, February, March, the trend line's going up, only there's a lot of variability in January, February because of competition. Now if we talk to time to peak force, which I call TF max, we do see meaningful change, very large meaningful change. She was very stable throughout the first year and a half, and then when we started to put this into place, what did she do? She shortened that curve. She got to that peak much quicker, so it went up and to the left. So you can see these are in milliseconds. This is how long it takes her when she drops down and that curve comes up to get to that top part. So she was hanging out at that 550 millisecond part for about a year, and all of a sudden when we put in all this extra focus on speed, monitoring, and making these choices, all of a sudden we started to go down. We started to get, if we go back, the jump height was going up, but more importantly, it was happening way faster. She cut that by 200 milliseconds. And if you look at the variability on each of these dots, we are 100% sure that these last, say, 5, 6 measures are all meaningfully different than before. They're all outside the confidence intervals we used to have. So we know there was real change in the time to peak force. So we're looking at a curve. We know that it went up and to the left. This one, FTCT, you can consider efficiency. It's flight time divided by contact time or time to take off. Now you'll also see RSI modified in the research a lot. And so this is an efficiency concept. You can see that she now spends way more time in the air compared to time on the ground over those last 5 months. And she did so, she hit her PR, her all-time best in sprinting in March when we had our championship, which we won, which is fantastic. And lastly, this is just peak force, relative peak force, or not relative, just peak force in a mid-thigh pull. I just wanted to show you that she did slowly get stronger through this season, even though that wasn't our focus. My time is up, so I just want to say thank you to all my friends, colleagues, and athletes and coaches who help make this possible and help contribute to what we do, especially when we're here and we go out at night and we drink beers. That's where a lot of time the best conversations happen. Thanks to the NSCA for letting me be here. And if you have any questions, I'll be outside.